I have no idea. Dad Bod History goes to the movies.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah, I guess we can do that.
All right.
So, yeah, we'll start with that, and then do you just want to get right into it, or you want to
Let's get right into it because I've been having this conversation in my head all day.
Dad Bod, Dad Bod, Dad Bod, Dad Bod. All right, folks, welcome to this episode of Dad Bod History, also known as Dad Bod Goes to the Movies. Today we're going to be talking about a movie that came out in 2016. It's called 13th, in regards to the 13th Amendment and its effect on American history, in particular its effect on African Americans throughout American history after the Civil War. So Eric and I both watched this movie, and I don't know about you, Eric, but for me it kind of...
I pulled it up and on Netflix.
Yeah, we both watched it on Netflix.
And I looked at it, and I'm like, it said resume, 4 minutes remaining. I'm like, have I seen this?
Uh-huh.
And I started it, and I'm like, I don't think I've seen this. Who's on my Netflix account? And then as it went on, I'm like, no, I've seen this. So I watched it a year or two ago. But it was a good refresher to watch it again.
Yeah, and for me, a friend of mine, a coworker of mine, Antoine, he suggested I watch it. He said it was a really good movie. It kind of came and went in 2016, and for me, I'd never heard of it before. And but today, especially with everything that's going on in regards to all the protests happening, and then the whole issue of police brutality and how that relates to race relations in America, this movie, it's almost better for 2020, I think, than it was for 2016. And in 2016, it was definitely important back then, but it was almost eerie how everything that they were talking about in some way, shape, or form related to kind of what's going on today.
Yeah, it ties in really well. And I think, watching it through a different lens when I watched it before, I watched it before and I found it interesting, but some of that stuff didn't really click with me in terms of the 13th Amendment having this this kind of, I don't know, additional thing to it. So it was refreshing. I'd say this is a well-made film, and it's very compelling.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I do have an issue with its overall thesis.
Okay. I guess before we get into that, let's get into the premise, and then we can kind of discuss what we liked and what we didn't like. And essentially, the premise is that in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. And the 13th Amendment is the amendment that officially, constitutionally ended slavery in America. Specifically, it says slavery and involuntary servitude, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction, including territories like Puerto Rico, Guam.
Right.
And so that was the premise, was that this was passed in January of 1865, and this is what abolished slavery. However, there's this phrase within that amendment: involuntary servitude and slavery are banned except as punishment for a crime whereof the party has been duly convicted. And so this is where I think Ava DuVernay, who's the director, and she's the one that created this film, Ava DuVernay, took this and she created this film, and she said, because of this clause in the 13th Amendment, people, and in particular white Southerners, disaffected from losing the Civil War and slavery ending, could use that as a loophole to create laws that would force black men in particular back into slavery. Whether you called it slavery or not was different, but in effect, they were saying that this reestablished slavery in America, or I guess never let slavery in America die.
And
maybe a different way
if you asked anybody on the street, should prisoners be put to work? effectively unpaid. Most people would be like, I got no problem with that.
Sure.
And because I think under the underlying idea there is you are working off the debt, and so your work is your payment on debt, right?
Yep. Paying your debt to society.
I believe incarcerated convicts, if they do work, they do get paid. It's like pennies on the
Definitely
dollar.
not minimum wage.
No, and so of course they're getting fed, they're getting housed. I get that's all kind of beside the point.
Mm-hmm.
But so that wording, I've never really taken a good close look at the 13th Amendment. But if I read this, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, and that's great. But the clause, except as punishment for a crime. So again, that premise that clause is used to very quickly convict people of crimes and also pass laws that would make more things crimes so that you could get a slave force to start working again, or a prisoner force back in the workforce. And so, again, this goes into, well, then you've got Jim Crow, and you get into the private prison system that exists today, where there's a corporation that runs all these prisons, and they're privately run, and their stock goes up when they have more prisoners because the state pays them based on the number of prisoners. So that's going to incentivize them to have more prisoners. And kind of as the film goes on, it tracks things. We had Jim Crow, we had the Civil Rights Movement, and then in the 1970s, there was a push to really get tough on crime, get tough with on Nixon. Drugs. The same thing happened in the 80s under Reagan. The same thing happened in the 90s, and I think this was interesting because there's a part of the film that just felt really off. And without getting too political, it spent about 2 minutes really going after Trump. Like it was just like you could play this as an ad in the upcoming election. And
it's funny because this came out before he was president. This was as he was running for president.
It came out in 2017, right? 2016?
I think it came out in 2016 is what I remember seeing. But he was running, whether or not he was just president, or he was running, it came out right around that time. And it's interesting because part of what you're referencing, I think, is when they talk about the Central Park Five and how Trump put out this full-page ad, right, to bring back the death penalty to have these 5 young black men executed for, was it raping a woman in Central Park in the early 90s?
I can't remember.
And then DNA evidence exonerated these 5 men, but they'd spent 12, 14 years in jail for a crime they didn't commit.
Yeah, they referenced his comments back in the 90s. There's a portion where he's talking from one of his rallies, right? And it's superimposing these images from the 60s and 50s over his campaign rhetoric, which they're unrelated, but man, it ties it together for you to give you a really good picture. So the reason I bring that up is because they get to the 90s and Bill Clinton, and they have Bill Clinton and Hillary being all apologetic about the 1994 crime bill, shouldn't have passed it. They don't mention, again, if this was 2016, 27, not a big deal, that this was Joe Biden's bill. He wrote this thing to be tough on crime. When he was still able to get through an entire sentence and paragraph without saying or stumbling, he wrote a crime bill that had the mandatory minimums, that had like the 3 strikes and you're out, like all these things that when we apply them to the kind of crimes that they're likely to find these young African American men guilty of, like possession of marijuana or a small amount of a drug, suddenly you can get these guys locked up for years at a time. And there's a story of Khalil Broward, is that right? The young guy who was arrested, come back from a party, and they put him in Rikers Island, and it
And he
basically
waited 3
destroyed
years
his life.
before a trial.
Yeah, and so
Before
you're
he was even
seeing,
tried, he just sat in jail for 3 years.
and you don't get bail. So he's rotting there. When we say rotting, it's a mental rot, right? You're exposed to that kind of violence and that kind of inhumanity, and the dehumanization that goes on, whether
And
it's
he
between
wouldn't,
prisoners or with guards.
and,
Yeah,
and he wouldn't accept the guilty plea. And they said, "You accept the guilty plea, you get to leave." But he's like, "No, because I didn't commit this crime." And
right.
so the way it was framed is almost they were punishing him for refusing to accept guilt for something he didn't do.
Yeah, and so this is another part of kind of criminal justice that we see as being difficult is the whole plea bargain thing. Listen, if you plead guilty, you'll get this amount of time. But if you go to trial, it's going to be worse. And it's like, well, if you're not guilty, why take a plea bargain? Because it's easier at the moment. And
Yeah.
um,
Well,
you know,
and public defenders have an outrageous caseload.
Yeah.
They have hundreds of cases that they have to get through as quick as possible. So they can't put the time, effort, and money into each individual case to serve it justice, essentially.
So
But the prosecutors, in a sense, have unlimited funds because they have
the state.
Yeah, they have the state supporting them.
And in that, I'm. It's so frustrating that the name is, I think, Khalif Broward or something, Browning. He goes in, and when he finally gets out, when he finally gets exonerated, he gets home. He can't take it. He takes his story to the media. It kind of a big deal, but he can't handle mentally what he went through, and he ends up taking his own life, which is just tragic. The prison system should never result in that kind of action. And I've heard the argument that plea bargains
Khalil
should be...
Muhammad.
What was that?
Khalil Muhammad is his name.
Muhammad.
Khalil Gibran Muhammad.
Okay. That the plea bargain should be gotten rid of because it's misused. That the state should have to prove your guilt. Even if you plead guilty, the state still has to prove it. They have to show it. And even if you're like, yeah, I did this and I'll show you how I did it, it should still have to go before a jury. Because the state should, if they're going to exercise that kind of force, they have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed this crime. And the issue is that'll take years. And so where do you put people while they're waiting for trial? Obviously, if it takes 3 years to get to trial and you end up in Rikers, you're toast. So there's a great miniseries on HBO, The Night Of, which is it's basically this story. There's this guy. I think he's like Pakistani American. He's upstanding citizen in college. He goes to a party, meets a girl. She ends up dead. He doesn't know how because he was intoxicated, and he ends up getting the crime pinned on him. He ends up going to Rikers Island. Ends up having to do all this stuff to keep himself alive there, to go through trial. He's got this defense attorney who's just a mess and and so, eventually he's exonerated, but he gets out and he is a hardened criminal by the end of it because of what he experienced in prison. So I think that's an important piece of this whole thing. And so we kind of really got away from the initial stuff of the film. But I think the point there is our justice system incentivizes through the private prisons, through these deals, things like ALEC, which I've heard of, and there's other groups like that, incentivizes putting as many people in prison as possible.
Yeah.
And doing it efficiently and quickly. And it destroys communities. I mean, if you can imagine, if for some reason you ended up going to prison, it can be for like a month you go to prison. I mean, how does your family recover from that?
I probably lose my job.
You don't get it back.
Yeah. So there's there's no guarantee my wife stays with me, even if it is for a short period of time.
Yeah.
You know, so then I might lose my kids. It's going to be a hard time for me to get a job back because I was convicted of a crime, which they make a point of is anytime you apply for a job in the movie,
Yeah.
especially if it's a felony, then that kind of blacklists you from future employment. So then you're limited in future jobs you can get. And and this is, as you said, for me, who has the benefit of being a white man in America, even still, going to prison when the justice system is set up to keep a lot of people in prison. I think by the end they said there's over 2 million people in prison.
Yeah, 2.5.
Which far exceeds any other developed nation in the world. In even when you consider population and factor in those things, I think that was something that struck with me in this movie was that we say we are the land of the free. However, if on any given day there's 2.5 million Americans sitting in prison, that's not free. And I think that's what really kind of stuck out to me is we can't make a claim for something when we are routinely locking up our own people. And that doesn't mean to excuse crime or poor behavior. That's not it at all. But when they were doing these, going back to kind of the beginning of the film, after the 13th Amendment was passed, and they wanted to kind of create these laws, which eventually became known as the Jim Crow laws, to arrest young black men to keep them working on the plantations that they thought they were liberated from. Some of the laws were like vagrancy, or failure to pay a tax because you wanted to be something other than a farmer, or loitering. Like it was, or what was it called? Malicious mischief, which is so vague and so broad.
I'm pretty sure 7th graders would be convicted of that.
Every single one of them, every single middle schooler in America would have to go to jail for malicious mischief if that's an actual crime that's on the books. And what's funny is bringing that to modern day, when I was watching on Twitter a lot of these protests and people with their cell phone cameras out and, you know, kind of, you can say they were antagonizing the police, but they weren't doing anything physically. They were just yelling at them. And one of the guys yelled at a police officer and he swore. And the police officer came over, knocked him down, and arrested him for cussing in public. I'm like, that is not a crime. Like, or if it is, it shouldn't be. And I think that's what gets me is that a lot of these laws were specifically set up to affect black Americans. I do believe that part of the movie. But even if they weren't, these are not laws that should exist in a free society. If that's something that we're claiming to hold to, a free society doesn't allow people for cussing in public. They don't arrest people for malicious mischief, whatever that is. Those are laws that are set up by authoritarian governments to keep their people under control, which is not what America proposes or purports to be.
And I think, you know, I think you have a similar perspective, being generally a lowercase L libertarian. Fewer laws is probably going to be better. Yeah. We don't need to outline every little behavior we don't like and outlaw it so we can throw people in prison for something we don't like. Now, I see plenty of people on Facebook and Twitter like, oh, they should throw them in jail for that. No, they shouldn't. They shouldn't. And among some of the other groups I follow, you know, basically every law that's on the book should end with, or we will kill you. Because that's the truth, right? I mean, if you don't pay your taxes, they're not going to kill you. Well, the IRS has a pretty heavily armed wing of its department. They will kick down your door. And if you resist, I mean, if you resist enough, anything they consider lethal force, they'll kill you. Yeah. Or they'll throw you in prison until you accede to their demands. So that's kind of, yes, laws come with the threat of force. That's how it's always been. That's how you enforce them, with the threat of violence. It's basically how it works. Yeah. But at the same time, while I can sympathize with a lot of the different parts of this film, and with a lot of the big ideas. Obviously, There needs to be some major criminal justice reform, some major reform to our police departments and how we treat people. The fact that Brock Turner, who was witnessed as raping someone, an unconscious woman, in an alley.
Oh, was that the Stanford kid?
Yeah, got off with 3 months because of, he's got a bright future, so we should let him off. And yet, George Floyd, well, he did some bad things. Yeah, he may have. I've done some bad things too. Doesn't mean he deserves to die. His crime, his alleged crime, what the police were called for, was a counterfeit $20 bill. Mm-hmm. So what is the appropriate response to that? How do you deal with that appropriately? Now, this is where we can get into the whole defund the police thing that's going on right now, which I think is interesting. I'm curious about it. I think there's some merit to the argument, but at the same time, what's the alternative? Now, we're recording this on Thursday. Okay, Seattle has this autonomous zone, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone that covers now 7 blocks, I think, at the moment. They have their own police force in there already, and they all have semi-automatic rifles. Most police officers don't carry those around with them on their person. That's what the autonomous zone, protesting police, is using. Yeah,
which is ironic.
Yeah, it's like, and they're shaking people down for money. They're extorting money from businesses. They're asking for fees. So I guess here's where my criticism of this film, 13th, comes in. And the criticism is more, I guess there's 2 parts. The first part is, when I see a film like this, it says the 13th Amendment is racist. And then says the war on drugs is racist and the 1994 crime bill is racist. I have to kind of appeal to my ideals and reason, in that when I look at the text of the laws that are written, they're not racist. They are, in fact, not racist. Now, the 13th Amendment, whoever it was written by, because there's actually a couple of amendments that went into it. One sounded great. They turned that down. The Senate turned it down. And the southern states that voted on the amendment had basically approved governments in them by this point. The text of it is not racist. And so I have to, again, appeal to my reason here and say, was there malicious intent here, or is it incompetence? And I'd say 90% of the time it's incompetence. Somebody wrote this law. Everyone looked at it and said, that makes sense. Somebody who's in prison should maybe do some work to pay off their debt. But nobody, they were incompetent, and then nobody saw this can be easily misused. And so then states say, listen, it's 1867. I'm walking around my town. I see a bunch of freed slaves hanging out. They don't have jobs. I don't think they should be hanging out. We should make a law against that. And that might be racist. So it's the premise and the thesis that comes with this kind of film is that the United States is inherently a racist nation, and that all of our documents and all of our founding documents, everything that we're built on, is inherently racist. And I simply refute that, because it's in the text. It's not. However, it has been used and misused by people who hold racist opinions. And people who some might have malicious intent, but most, I'd say, are just incompetent and don't see the unintended consequences of the laws that they're writing. We have that today. Like, the Patriot Act, everyone was thumbs up on it. Nobody realized the unintended consequences of that. Or the 1994 crime bill. Like, it sounds good to say you have to... Listen, if you broke a law, there's a minimum... You shouldn't get out early. Okay, for possession of 3 ounces of marijuana? Really? Yeah. Is that worth it? We're going to ruin a life and then turn that person into a criminal.
And I think you're making a couple of good points on this.
I'm making a lot of good points.
You always make a lot of good points. And I I tend to agree with you in the sense that I don't believe America is to its core a racist nation. However, I do think that a lot of the things that have been put into law in America have been done to make it more difficult for blacks or Hispanics or Asians. I mean, there's been laws that have constantly been put into place to make it more difficult for them to either come to this country or to succeed while they are in this country. In the 1920s, when they restricted immigration from China, that was one. And then you could even say during World War One, when we went to war with Germany.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, we have immigration quotas right now. And I'd say, but outside of the Japanese internment legislation and outside of the laws banning immigration specifically from China.
But we haven't even been kind to other white people. Irish need not apply. Like, it's not like...
Okay, that hits home. That hits
home. Okay. So you see what I'm saying? Like, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, we've always had this nativist element to us. And that anytime a new immigrant group comes here, we always collectively view them with some sort of suspicion, like they're going to be the downfall of America, or they're going to steal all our jobs.
That's not a new thing, but that's something that I think is specific to the United States, in that we kind of said, hey, we have opportunity here. We have massive amounts of land.
Sure.
They're inhabited, but we can deal with that, right? I mean, we can always kick the natives out another few miles.
Yeah, which is its own...
Right, that's a whole other issue. Thing. But so it's not like Germany for the past 1,500 years has had its borders open to whoever wants to come in. It's just been German until recently. And we see that kind of nativist stuff is working its way through Europe, because they're like, hold on, we're losing who we are. So I think that's kind of a specific American thing, in that we have always been open, or often
and there's always been xenophobes. You're right. There's been xenophobic trends all throughout the world for all time. However, the difference with African Americans is we brought them here without their consent. We made them our slaves. And then when we freed them, they said, yeah, but not really. You still can't vote. You still can't get a job unless you pay this extra fee. So by circumstance, we made it more difficult for them to achieve the American dream.
Well, I'd say that was states doing that. So the United States, once we passed 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, in terms of American law, they were full citizens. Now,
sure,
a lot of states, and a lot of people in a lot of states really weren't ready for that. And again, we talked about that when we talked about what if the South didn't secede and there's no Civil War. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of this stuff doesn't have the kind of division we see it having now. I don't think we see... I feel like there'd be less of that kind of racist tension if the Civil War hadn't been fought, because the Civil War hurt everyone. Mm-hmm. And afterwards, it was like suddenly these people are equal citizens, and they should have been, but that was forced upon people who they weren't ready to see that, and that's hard. It should be done, but it's hard for those people.
But I will say, these laws, whether or not they're racist, they're bad law.
Oh.
And I think that's something that you can look at. And this is why I looking at these protests and all this stuff, and while the black men are disproportionately jailed in America versus white men or people from another race, that is a real statistic, and black men tend to die at the hands of police far more than white men.
Well, okay.
However, the law itself is not a good law. Like, that's the problem. And it's like, whether or not it was set up to be specifically targeted for black men over white or otherwise, they're not good laws. Mandatory minimums are not good for American people, regardless of your racial background. And I think that's where we need to reevaluate how we do justice.
Mandatory minimums and 3-strike laws, 3-strike-year outlaws, it takes power away from the person, the boots on the ground, the judge, to look at this and say, okay.
Which was a good point they made in that film, is that judges were no longer able to to
Yeah,
judge.
like I have to sentence you to 10 years, even though I see all the circumstances around this and you really don't deserve it and you're 18 or 17 and you're going to go to prison for 10 years. You're going to come out at 27 and not be ready for the world. You're going to be ready to commit more crime because that's all you're going to learn over the next 10 years. Yeah, there are laws that are badly written and we only get more every year. So I think that's a big piece of it. When it comes, so here's the other point I wanted to kind of get to. You said African American men are incarcerated at a higher rate for the population than say white men, and that's a true fact. But dying at the hands of police, and I heard a statistic last week that was like 9 African American men died at the hands of police last year as opposed to like 18 or 20 white men. Okay, so I heard that statistic and I said, okay, that's a good statistic because it kind of, it makes a point that says that statistic tells you that the police are not necessarily being racist. Now, it does not include any police brutality or excessive force or anything like that, but just with the deaths at the hands of police. And I thought of that. I'm like, well, that's a good fact. But if I present that to present that fact to somebody who says to me, listen, when I'm driving home at night, I'm a black man, I'm driving home at night, and I see the lights come on, and I get pulled over, and I'm fearful for my life. That's a truth. There are facts which might tell you, hey, police do not mistreat you more. But there's also a truth that I feel scared, I feel frightened when I have to deal with the police because I'm not sure what's going to happen. And I've had bad run-ins in the past. Yeah, don't do bad things. Just stop with that. I'm tired of hearing, don't break the law. Yeah, we get it. Don't break the law. Sometimes, and listen, I think everyone breaks laws. Everyone speeds. So stop with the don't break the law. Because if you know all the laws, then maybe you can avoid breaking any of them.
It's almost...
but what I was going to say is the fear is just as real.
Yeah.
That terror of thinking, this could happen to me. That's a real thing. And I generally subscribe to facts don't care about your feelings statement. Generally.
Yeah.
But listen, feelings are a real thing in terms of how you feel about something. When my son wakes up in the middle of the night and he's terrified and won't go back into his bed, like, that's just as real. Because we have to deal with it. And so that fear that the African American community deals with in terms of police has to be dealt with. I don't know how to deal with it, but that's something that has to be addressed. First of all, let's take bad laws off the books, and then let's start working on how to do these things. Now, Black Lives Matter. I think the capital, or the lowercase, uppercase matters. And I heard a lot of the statements, Black Lives Matter. That statement, I don't see anything wrong with that statement. However, I'm looking into a lot of this stuff, and this is where I get a little bit concerned with where things are at the moment, because the umbrella group to Black Lives Matter, which is just a website and a hashtag, there's an umbrella group that's, Progress for Black Lives. And they have a policy statement that has a bunch of sets of policies. That's where I get really concerned because, I'm watching 13th and I see some of the people coming up. And Van Jones, generally, I like him, disagree with on a lot of things. But Angela Davis comes up and she was kind of a radical. She stood up to the system, and I think that's really important. But when we look at these people and some of the roots they have and what they're advocating for and what some of these groups are advocating for. Listen, anyone who disagrees with the statement that Black Lives Matter is wrong, because they do matter. And we know all lives matter, but we want to point out that they matter just as much. That's the point.
But all lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter,
right.
Which is kind of the...
Right. I was in a place a few years ago where I'm like, yeah, all lives matter. Come on. But the thing is, they do, and we have to get to a point where they feel like they matter too. To the state, none of these lives matter. None of ours do.
No, I would agree.
That's my hot take. To the state, none of our
You
lives
heard it here
matter.
first, folks.
So, but like Angela Davis, she's a communist. She's a Marxist. She was part of the Communist Party
Yeah,
up until like 2005.
proudly
And
so.
that's fine. Now, I'll say this. Communists look at the Constitution. They look at a document that they want to tear down. The official umbrella group that that is kind of in charge of Black Lives Matter, they have policy demands. It's a movement for Black Lives, and they've got their policy platforms. And I recommend everyone go look at them. We can say Black Lives Matter, but you need to understand that when you get on board with some stuff, you're getting on board with a group that actually looks at the nuclear family as being antiquated and needs to go away. Redistribution of wealth, not progressive income tax, redistribution of wealth. I'm talking about wealth tax, which is you have wealth that you've earned over your lifetime. We're going to start taxing that wealth away. Like defunding the police, which something needs to happen with the police. I don't think defunding it completely is the goal. Maybe demilitarizing the police would be a start. Because when they roll up with tanks and armored personnel carriers, that's not the best look, and that's an escalation of violence. I'm looking at the Seattle Autonomous Zone, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and if tanks roll up on that place, it's going to look worse than Waco did.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, just.
But I think the point you're making in regards to Black Lives Matter and its parent group or organization is that while you can agree with the movement or the goal of the term Black Lives Matter, you need to be aware that the group behind the group, in a sense, may not have a typical America's best interest sort of thing at heart, in the sense of traditional capitalism and freedom and not redistribution of wealth. Instead, it would kind of be the antithesis of that.
Right. I think it comes from a place where they say, what I disagree with the thesis on, is that America and all its laws, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, is all based on the desire to hold slaves and keep slavery, and it's racist at its core, and so that would come from like the 1619 Project, which is when the first slave came to the United States. So since then, everything has been designed to keep slaves. The issue there is if when you say that, and you say it's racist to its core, then you're saying we have to tear it down to nothing and then build on that. It's like, well, I'm looking at your policies. We're 103 years after the Russian Revolution started, and that regime lasted for, 73 years? Cost 20 million lives. When I see them talking about having community councils come up in different cities to listen to its workers, those are called Soviets. And they started in 1917. And they targeted people and killed people. So we're a nation of laws.
One authoritarian with a new authoritarian.
Right. And it's just this is what our system is. And our system is flawed. I don't think it's racist at its core. It's not a racist system, although it's been misused and incompetent people have used it, and it's hurt a lot of people.
Yeah.
And our system is great because it makes progress.
Well, it was set up to improve. The whole framing of the Constitution was set up that we didn't write this perfectly. We didn't set up this country perfectly, but we did set it up to change and to get better. And it has changed, and it has gotten better. And something that you brought up when you were talking about this parent group of Black Lives Matter and how they kind of want to tear it all down and then rebuild it from the ground up. And I think something that's interesting is that, and on the opposite end, people who say, well, if you broke the law, you need to go to jail because that's what you do. You're a lawbreaker. You're a criminal, right? And they both kind of ignore the idea of redemption, and
Yeah.
in that America as a nation can be redeemed. We can get better. That means we have to recognize our failures and we have to recognize our national sins, for a lack of a better term. But we can get better. Tearing down the whole country is not going to redeem us. Conversely, a young black man who goes to jail for possession of a drug is not a criminal. He's someone who can be redeemed and he can become better. And I'm not saying he was bad in the first place, but that's the whole beauty of being human, and especially a Christian. If you claim to be a Christian, redemption's kind of the whole point. And I think individually we can be redeemed, but nationally and as a culture, we can be redeemed as well. And I think when you get too far in one extreme or the other, you forget about redemption and it's all about revenge or punishment or payback or something
Oh,
else.
we'll call it law and order, though. We just
Sure.
want law and order. And it's like, well, yeah, when you protest, and I think for me the biggest thing is consistency.
Yeah.
It's fine. I'm so glad people are protesting. There was a picture that came out, and I saw it in a couple different places, of some Black Panthers in Washington, D.C., the American kind, not the Wakandan kind. And they had assault rifles.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, they had semi-automatic rifles, and they were carrying them, and they had their vests on. And they were marching. And I was like, first of all, that totally turns several narratives on its head, right? On their heads. And I'm just like, good for them. They're exercising
Exactly.
the first two amendments, the first two rights that were given. Go for it. I disagree with you on several of your tenets and what you want. When I see, these dangerous right-wingers are carrying rifles around towns, and it's going to get violent. I'm like, they haven't committed any violence. Those people who are walking around with those rifles are protecting their homes or communities, businesses. Maybe some of them might be looking for a fight, but they're just, I think, just wanting to protect their community. And the same with the people who are at the checkpoints of this Capitol Hill autonomous zone. I mean, they have the right to do that. They can. I think. I don't know what the police are doing. I don't know what their plan is. But the fact that instead of looking at everyone we see as something, why think the worst about somebody? Why not look at somebody that comes on and say, I want to think the best about them. Let me find the thing that makes me want to find the best in them, and treat them as an individual. And I know that's a dog whistle for white supremacy somehow, but why can't we just treat everyone as an individual?
If in our Declaration we state all men are created equal, and we believe that, then we need to start treating all men and women as equal, and stop putting them in silos where it's like, oh, well, they're thugs, or they're neocons, or they're wingers, or whatever pejorative label you want to put on them to make you feel better about, I guess, your place, and see them as an individual and see them as a human.
Yeah.
And then as an American. Like, that's the thing that bothers me. It's like, we're all American, and yet we somehow always, whether what side you're on or not, we always put the other group down as something less than. And I guess that bothers me, and I don't know.
Well, the pejoratives and the labeling and the groupthink and the identity politics, they all serve to dehumanize individuals. If all I think of you as an African American, or as a white boy, or as a liberal, or whatever it is, a boogaloo boy, all I'm doing is saying you're in this group, And then I put
Yeah.
value on different groups. And therefore, if you're in that group, then you have a value assigned to you based on what I think about that group. And therefore, it can dehumanize you. And not to go this route, but that's what the Nazis did. And that's what the Soviets did. And they said, here's a group, and this group is dangerous. They're a problem. Let's all start looking at them as a different group. And once we've done that for a few years, then we can find a reason to dehumanize them a little more. And then we can actually go in. And if you're the kulaks in the Soviet Union, we can drive you out and send you to Siberia and kill you. If you're the Jews in Germany and Poland during World War II, we can round you up and kill you.
Put you in the camps.
If you're Japanese American during World War II, we can put you into internment camps. All of this stuff. And it starts with, here's an other, here's someone who's different. We're going to look at them not as individuals, but as a group. And that kind of group identity politics, it just destroys individuals. And our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, is set up when we look at individuals. We look at people who have rights. And that's what, and again, come back to when I look at Western civilization, not that it came from white people, but that what Western civilization did, it said, here are individuals, they have reason and power, and they're divine in their own way. And that's why individuals are the basis for our laws and cultures. And if we tear that down, then all we end up with is tribes again.
Yeah.
And tribes that want to kill each other based on whatever differences we want to find. So I like the movie. I think it's very compelling. I think it's an important watch. Except for a couple specific scenes, I was just like, that's obviously pushing it a little far in terms of how they're portraying people and framing people. I enjoyed it, and it's something that I think everyone should watch so they understand the history of this group of people that was in our country and what they've endured in many circumstances. So I recommend it, but read. You got to take time to read about things and understand them before you say, I'm in on this.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I enjoyed it. I thought it was very compelling, and it provides a narrative that I'm not really familiar with. I'm never going to say there's any such thing as a true documentary. I don't think those truly exist. Any documentarian has a story that they're trying to tell. And I think she had a story, but it was a compelling story, and it was a story that wasn't fanciful. It wasn't made out of thin air. It was real. Like for the most part, these things happened. Now you can say, I disagree with this point, or I disagree with where they're going with it, but for me
the motives for me, like to say that this was all from a racist motive, I can't say that's 100% true. I'd say more so out of incompetence and unwillingness to understand their fellow citizens, and that's what African Americans were after 1865. And maybe ignorance too, but that's something that every nation has to work through. We all wish they worked through quicker, but these things take time, and there's so much here that I don't think we got to today. But
yeah, we stopped talking about the movie 20 minutes ago, but it was. I think a good movie or a good film is supposed to spur this kind of discussion, and in that case, this thing wildly succeeded.
Yeah,
it helped me reevaluate my own paradigm, my own worldview, which I think is important for me to do, because if I'm not checking myself, if I'm not judging my own beliefs and my own values.
Mine is 100% on. I haven't had a problem with mine.
Well, and that's why I like being your friend, is because I can always rank myself against what you say and then go, okay, well, clearly I'm wrong because Eric said something different. But I think any good movie can make you, like this, a serious documentary can make you look and go, well, I hadn't thought of it that way before. And if it does that, then I think that's a success.
Yeah, maybe I can change my view, and maybe I can look at how I can see if there are other solutions to this problem. And I think that's what 2020 has been for a lot of people is, here's what I understood before, and here's this new circumstance. What am I learning about myself and my community, how we relate, and all those things. And this movie gave me some good information that I hadn't had before, and it's good to understand the roots of a lot of these things and how they played out over the course of 160 years and still do. So, so Dad Bod History Goes to the Movies.
Yeah, we saw 13th. Really good film. So that's it, and we'll see you next time.